It was supposed to be a private moment between two old friends. But when Johnny Carson whispered something to a crying Debbie Reynolds, a live microphone captured everything. What 22 million people heard that night became the most talked about moment in Tonight Show history. May 12th, 1983. The Tonight Show was in full swing, and Johnny Carson was interviewing one of Hollywood's most beloved stars, Debbie Reynolds. At 51 years old, Reynolds was still as vibrant and talented as she had been during her golden age of musicals. Though the years had brought their share of heartbreak and challenge, she had come to The Tonight Show to promote her latest stage production and to share stories from her remarkable career. The interview had started with all the warmth and humor that defined Johnny and Debbie's long friendship. They had known each other for decades, and their on-screen chemistry was genuine and effortless. Debbie was making the audience laugh with stories about Gene Kelly and Frank Sinatra, and Johnny was doing what he did best, creating the perfect space for his guests to shine. But 20 minutes into the interview, something shifted. Johnny had just asked what seemed like a simple question about Debbie's daughter, Carrie Fisher, who was becoming famous in her own right after Star Wars. It was the kind of question he had asked 1,000 times before, a gentle inquiry about family that was meant to be light and conversational. "How are the kids doing?" Johnny asked with his characteristic warmth. "Carrie's really making a name for herself, and I hear Todd is following in your footsteps too." Debbie's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, so briefly that most people in the audience didn't notice. But Johnny Carson, with his decades of experience reading people, saw it immediately. "They're doing wonderfully," Debbie said, her voice still bright but with something underneath it that hadn't been there before. She's such a talent, Johnny. She's going to be a huge star." "But?" Johnny asked gently, sensing there was more. That single word, "but," was all it took. Debbie Reynolds, who had spent her entire career projecting strength and resilience, who had survived one of Hollywood's most public scandals when Eddie Fisher left her for Elizabeth Taylor, who had faced financial ruin and rebuilt her life multiple times, suddenly couldn't hold it together anymore. Tears began rolling down Debbie's face before she could stop them. She tried to laugh them away, reaching for a tissue that Ed McMahon quickly provided, but her composure was completely gone. "I'm sorry," Debbie said, wiping her eyes. "I don't know what's wrong with me tonight." "Hey," Johnny said, "don't apologize. This is a safe place. It's just that..." Debbie struggled to get the words out through her tears. "Carrie is so talented, but she's been having such a hard time lately. And I don't know how to help her, Johnny. I'm her mother, and I don't know how to fix this." The studio audience fell silent. This wasn't the glamorous Hollywood star they had expected to see. This was a mother in pain, worried about her daughter, and the authenticity of the moment was almost overwhelming. Johnny signaled to Fred DeCordova to go to commercial, and the show cut away from the live broadcast. But what nobody in the control room realized, what would only become apparent later, was that while the cameras had stopped broadcasting, Johnny's microphone was still hot and feeding to the studio monitors. As the studio lights dimmed slightly for the commercial break, Johnny stood up from his desk and walked over to Debbie, who was still sitting in the guest chair trying to compose herself. The studio audience watched in respectful silence as Johnny sat on the edge of his desk, directly in front of Debbie, and leaned in close. What happened next was captured by Johnny's still live microphone and broadcast through the studio speakers, where every member of the audience, and unbeknownst to anyone, the home audience whose local stations hadn't fully cut away from the feed, could hear every word. "Debbie," Johnny said, his voice so quiet and gentle that it barely carried through the speakers. "I want you to listen to me very carefully. You are not failing as a mother. Do you hear me? You are not failing." Debbie shook her head, more tears falling. "But she needs help, Johnny, and I don't know what to do." "The fact that you know she needs help means you're already doing the most important thing," Johnny continued. "You're paying attention. You're caring. And sometimes that's all we can do. Just be there and let them know we love them no matter what." What came out in those next few minutes, captured accidentally by the live microphone, was something that Johnny had never discussed publicly. Johnny began talking about his own son, about struggles with depression and substance abuse, that the Carson family had kept carefully hidden from the public eye. "My son Richard," Johnny said, his voice thick with emotion. "He's been battling his own demons for years. And I spent so long thinking I could fix it, thinking that if I just said the right thing or did the right thing, I could make it better. But you can't fix everything, Debbie. Sometimes all you can do is love them and make sure they know you're there." The studio audience, hearing this unguarded confession from a man who had spent decades keeping his private life private, sat in stunned silence. This wasn't Johnny Carson, the entertainer. This was Johnny Carson, the father, sharing his own pain with a friend who needed to hear that she wasn't alone. "How do you deal with it?" Debbie asked, her voice small and vulnerable. "How do you keep going when you're so worried about them?" "Some days I don't deal with it very well," Johnny admitted. "But I've learned that I can't control their journey. I can only control whether I'm there for them when they need me. And you're there for Carrie, Debbie. I know you are. That's what good parents do." In the control room, Fred DeCordova suddenly realized what was happening. One of the audio technicians had noticed that Johnny's microphone levels were still showing activity and had alerted him. "Cut that mic!" Fred shouted, but it was already too late. The conversation had been going on for nearly 3 minutes, and every word had been audible through the studio monitors. Worse, several NBC affiliates around the country had stayed on the live feed instead of cutting to local commercials, meaning that viewers in certain markets had heard the entire exchange. By the time the control room realized what was happening and cut the feed entirely, hundreds of thousands of people had heard Johnny Carson's most private thoughts about his own family struggles. When The Tonight Show came back from commercial break, both Johnny and Debbie were back in their positions, but something had fundamentally changed. Debbie's eyes were still red from crying, but there was a peace in her expression that hadn't been there before. Johnny looked different too, more vulnerable, more human. The NBC switchboard lit up within minutes, but instead of complaints about the technical error or the heavy emotional content, the calls were overwhelmingly supportive. People were calling to share their own stories of struggling to help loved ones with mental health issues or addiction. Parents were calling to thank Johnny and Debbie for being so honest about the challenges of raising children, especially when those children were adults. The next day, newspapers across the country ran stories about what was being called the microphone moment. Mental health advocates praised Johnny Carson for his unexpected candor about his son's struggles, saying it helped destigmatize conversations about depression and substance abuse. What few people knew was that the accidental broadcast of that private moment actually strengthened the friendship between Johnny Carson and Debbie Reynolds. In the weeks following the show, they spoke regularly, supporting each other through their respective family challenges. Johnny helped Debbie find resources for Carrie, connecting her with mental health professionals who specialized in treating creative individuals struggling with bipolar disorder, though Carrie wouldn't be publicly diagnosed for several more years. And Debbie, in turn, was one of the few people Johnny felt comfortable talking to about his ongoing concerns for his son. "That night changed both of us," Debbie would later say in interviews. "Johnny was always so guarded about his private life, and suddenly, we had both shared our deepest fears with millions of people. But you know what? It was freeing. We didn't have to pretend everything was perfect anymore." Johnny Carson's accidental revelation about his son's mental health struggles had far-reaching effects. In the 1980s, conversations about depression and substance abuse were still heavily stigmatized, particularly when it came to the families of public figures. By admitting his own struggles as a parent trying to help a child with these issues, Johnny helped normalize these conversations. Mental health organizations reported a significant increase in calls to their hotlines in the weeks following the broadcast. Parents who had been suffering in silence, thinking they were alone in their struggles, suddenly realized that even someone as successful and together as Johnny Carson faced the same challenges. Years later, after Carrie Fisher became an outspoken advocate for mental health awareness and openly discussed her own struggles with bipolar disorder and addiction, she spoke about that night on The Tonight Show. "I didn't watch the show when it happened," Carrie said in a 2010 interview. But when I finally saw the footage years later, it made me cry. My mother and Johnny, two people who had every reason to keep their struggles private, chose to be vulnerable instead. And that vulnerability helped so many people, including me. Carrie credited that moment as part of what eventually gave her the courage to be open about her own mental health challenges. If Johnny Carson could admit he didn't have all the answers, if he could say out loud that he was struggling to help his son, then maybe it was okay for me to admit I was struggling too. Johnny rarely spoke about the incident publicly, but in a 1990 interview with Barbara Walters, he reflected on what happened that night. I was mortified when I found out the microphone was still live, Johnny admitted. I had spent my entire career keeping my private life private, and suddenly the whole country knew about my family's struggles. But you know what? It was probably the most important thing I ever did on that show. When Walters asked him to elaborate, Johnny continued, "Every night I made people laugh, and that's a good thing. Laughter is important. But that night, I think I helped people feel less alone. And maybe that matters more than all the jokes I ever told." After the incident, NBC instituted new protocols for microphone management during commercial breaks. Audio technicians were given explicit instructions to mute all microphones completely when going off air, and additional fail-safes were added to prevent similar accidents. But many people who worked on The Tonight Show believed the accident wasn't entirely accidental. Some audio engineers suggested that someone in the control room had made the conscious decision to leave Johnny's microphone hot, believing that what was being said was too important to cut off. If true, no one ever admitted to it, and NBC never conducted an investigation. The official story remained that it was a technical error, a simple mistake that happened to create one of the most meaningful moments in television history. Today, when television historians discuss the most important moments in talk show history, the night Johnny Carson's microphone captured his private conversation with Debbie Reynolds is always mentioned. It represents a turning point in how television approached mental health topics and in how public figures discussed private struggles. The moment also demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful television happens not when everything goes according to plan, but when something unexpected reveals genuine human connection and vulnerability. Johnny Carson spent 30 years entertaining America, but those 3 minutes of accidental honesty might have done more good than thousands of perfectly executed comedy bits. He showed that it's okay to struggle, okay to not have all the answers, and okay to admit that even the most successful people face challenges they can't always overcome. If this incredible story of accidental vulnerability and genuine friendship moved you, make sure to subscribe for more true stories about the moments when television became real. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that they're not alone in their struggles. And remember that sometimes the most important conversations are the ones we never planned to have.